Hello and welcome yet again to the Friday afternoon talk in its 8th edition. We are well past afternoon and dusk has descended in Kolkata from where I am talking, but we had to set this time due to the time zone differences with one of our panelists. Thank you yet again for a fabulous and an overwhelming response to the Friday afternoon talk, which we fondly called the FAT in its digital avatar. One good thing that has happened more confined, we will discuss Dr. Tanvi Madan's book, Fateful Triangle, How China Reshaped US-India Relations. The first part of the very catchy title of the volume, of course, resembles Noam Chomsky's 1983 book, The Fateful Triangle, The United States, Israel, and the Palestinians. And that book essentially dealt about the relationship between the US and Israel and the Arab Palestinians. Chomsky examined the origins of this relationship and the meaningful consequences for the Palestinians and the other Arabs. Tanvi's hypothesis in this particular volume takes a different turn to different geographies, but with US as the common point. Very interestingly, it has been hypothesized that shaping of the US-India relationship ever since the close of the Cold War has largely been influenced by the China factor. And Tanvi's book contests this existing belief. Rather, Tanvi argues that the concern of China had always been central to the US-India relations historically. So the present dynamics between US and India needs to be, or rather the present dynamics between the triad itself needs to be construed in continuum with the trend that prevailed even during the Cold War. And so in fact, as I was reading one of Tanvi's very recent essays published in one of the journals, China is indeed the dragon in the room for both the nations. And so it reminds me the metaphorical use of the term elephant for India, and we definitely would not like to have the term elephant in the room being used in the geostrategic or any space for India. I have just begun reading this particular book, and I'm wondering how this dynamics will unfold in the post-COVID world. Are we going to witness a closer US-India tie, with India playing a more prominent role in the Indo-Pacific, strengthening the Quad to combat the Chinese threat? What happens with Indian engagement in the South China Sea? Will it be a fly in the wall kind of an observer? And especially when US is getting more and more active to combat China. So who is going to be the dragon or the elephant in the room, and who will emerge as the fly in the wall? So there are a range of options, in fact, between these two extremes. And this remains an interesting concern to be watched in the unfolding future. So while Tanvi will talk about this very important, very critical work on assessing the geopolitical and the geostrategic issues from a historical perspective, one needs to keep in mind that history often bears lessons for the future. So are we going to witness a random walk model or a Markov chain phenomenon with the past having its bearing on the future as has been unfolded so far? Or will COVID-19 bring about a clear structural break in the dynamics of the triad? So as Dr. Madan discusses this book, at the very outset, I will pose this question to her, and I leave it to her to respond either during the presentation or afterwards. I am further delighted to have Mr. Anant Krishnan of The Hindu as a discussant. Welcome to you, Mr. Krishnan. Just to set the house rules over the digital space, what I'll do is I'll request Dr. Madan to speak for around 20 minutes. This will be followed by interventions from Mr. Anant Krishnan for around 10 minutes. Then we open this to the audience. There's a small chat icon on your Zoom screen. Please write your questions and comments there. I can read out from there and request the panelists to respond. So at the very outset, let me apologize that if there might be a host of questions and comments, so I just need to be a bit more selective about it. But I will try to be as representative as possible and select those of substantial general interest. So I request the audience to stick to very short interventions so that it is possible to accommodate as many questions as many comments as possible. With that, I move to Dr. Madan for her presentation. Over to you, Tanvi.
Thank you so much, Nilanjan, and to the Observer Research Foundation and to Anant in advance for his remarks. I'm particularly grateful that this Friday afternoon talk is more like a Friday early evening talk, so not a fat but a feat, to accommodate for my time zone in Washington. So thank you again. What I thought I'd do first off is just lay out some of the arguments in the book, and I'm just going to outline two key arguments that the book makes, and there are a lot of kind of sub-arguments that I hope you see when you read this book. But the two main arguments is that, as Nilanjan pointed out, today we take it almost for given that China shapes US-India relations. My book argues and shows that China's influence on the US-India relationship is not recent, and it wasn't episodic. In fact, this China's influence goes back to the early years of independence and of the early years of the Cold War. And that I argue that while it is clearly not the only factor that mattered in shaping US-India relationships historically, without understanding the role of China, you really cannot get a fuller understanding and a more comprehensive understanding of India-US relations without considering this factor. The second argument that this book makes is something to be said about the present and what history tells us about the present and the future. You hear arguments these days about whether or not a US-India alignment or partnership versus China is natural, it will naturally happen, or whether it's impossible because India doesn't do alignments or alliances. Well, my book shows that a US-India alignment or partnership versus China is neither inevitable nor impossible. It depends on certain conditions, and the book lays that out. And those conditions are that a US-India partnership requires not just convergence on the nature of a China challenge, but also on the urgency of that challenge and how to approach that challenge. And we maybe can get into kind of the details of that in the Q&A. But what I want to talk about first is kind of how this book started, and then just take you through the book, which covers the period 1949 to 1979, and start with the origins. I mean, when you're sitting in the archives, and this book has a lot of work that's based on archival research, on looking at newspapers from the time. When you're sitting in the archives, you feel a little bit, as Nilanjan talked about it, as a fly in the wall. And I was a fly in the wall, so to speak, in Austin, Texas, at the Lyndon Johnson Library, where I was going through papers from the Johnson administration related to US-India relations. And what I found was that they were quite intriguing to me because China kept popping up in the discussion. And two things in particular struck me. Two kind of stories struck me, two documents. One was US operational plans to intervene militarily on behalf of India if China intervened on behalf of Pakistan in the 1965 India-Pakistan war. This is something I didn't really know about. I knew obviously about the 1962 war and US involvement there, but this was intriguing to me. And the second was that there are detailed logs of rainfall amounts in India and their impact on Indian agriculture and the economy in these Johnson papers. It's things that LBJ himself and a number of officials seem to keep a close eye on. And the reason they were keeping a close eye on these kind of detailed rainfall figures was they wanted to ensure that India's economy succeeded and that a democratic India succeeded and didn't fail, while Soviet-backed communist China succeeded. And so this was intriguing to me because here there were these instances, historical from the mid-60s, where China seemed to be figuring in US policymakers' minds when they were thinking about India. And so I wanted to go and see how far back that influence in American policymakers' minds went, and how far back did China also influence how Indian policymakers were thinking about the US. And what I found was that this role of China went back to early years of Indian independence. China was what lay behind the warm welcome Nehru received when he became the first Indian Prime Minister to visit Washington in 1949. President Truman went to receive him at the airport. He took along 3 cabinet members and an honor guard. The US Congress hosted Prime Minister Nehru for a speech. What was the reason behind all this fanfare when Nehru came to Washington? What American policymakers saw as the loss of China to communism. Because just a few days before Nehru's visit in October 1949, Mao Zedong had declared the establishment of the People's Republic of China in Beijing. The establishment in the US now saw democratic India, this new kind of fledgling democracy, as quote unquote the hope of Asia. And the US thought and believed that India could serve, this democratic India could serve as a counterbalance and contrast to China. But during the course of Nehru's visit itself, and particularly in its aftermath, it became clear that India did not share the same view of and did not share the same approach to China as the US. And what that led to between 1949 and till about 1956 was a period of what I call in the book divergence. Instead of convergence on China pushing the US and India together, as we're familiar with today, during this period between 1949 and 1956, there was divergence between the US and India on China. The two countries disagreed about various sets of issues, whether to recognize the People's Republic of China or not, what to do about the Chinese takeover of Tibet, China's role in the Korean War and the reasons for its intervention, but also China's role in Southeast Asia. And finally, they disagreed on the approach to China. Even the Nehru government had some concerns about China, but they thought that the best way to mitigate or resolve those concerns was to engage China rather than to contain it, which they saw as the US approach. Prime Minister Nehru thought that bringing China into the international community instead of isolating it would encourage it to be a responsible stakeholder. But the Truman, and then when President Eisenhower came to office, those two administrations on the US side did not think that you could encourage or get China to be a responsible stakeholder. And these differences on China had an adverse impact on the US-India relationship, not just in the administration in the US, but also on Capitol Hill, where in the US Congress, it negatively affected discussions on whether or not and how much to aid India at the time. And that in turn caused resentment in New Delhi. But then around 1956, 1957, there's a start of what I call in the book a period of convergence. There's a change on China in both the US and India. And over the next few years, through about 1962, Delhi's and Washington's diagnosis of the China problem and their prescription for it start to converge. In the US, President Eisenhower starts to see the Cold War not just primarily as a geopolitical conflict, but also an ideological and economic competition more so as well. And in this context, the US could not see a democratic India fall behind while Soviet-backed communist China succeeded. And in this kind of argument, Washington had to help India win what was then called in the West, the fateful race against China. In India, Prime Minister Nehru and his officials had become more concerned about China as a geopolitical threat by this point in 56-57. For one, the boundary dispute comes to the fore in 1956-57 and intensifies over this period, obviously culminating in the 62 war. But India at this point is also concerned about China's increasing influence in Nepal. And then the Dalai Lama's escape to India in 1959 led to further strain between the two Asian giants. But you also see ideological and economic concerns in India as well about China. The Nehru government was concerned that communism next door would succeed in delivering the goods, so to speak, economically, and demonstrate that communism and communist governments were better at delivering the goods to the people than his democratic government was. And not only, so you see this convergence in perception on China, that it is now both the US and India see China as a concern, as a challenge. But you also see the US and India agreeing now on what to do about this challenge. And that part of the answer for both countries was a partnership with each other. For India, this came with American economic and eventually military assistance to India, culminating in direct American assistance, obviously, that we know about during the 1962 China-India war. But after that period, after that kind of the culmination of that in the 62 China-India war, you see over the next few years between 1963 and 1968 on the question of China, what I call a period of dependence and disillusionment between the US and India. And what happens is that while the two countries continue to agree that China is a major threat, they come to disagree on what to do about it. So on the one hand, there's dependence still between the two countries on this subject. India still needs the US to externally and internally balance against China. And the US on its part still needs India not to fail politically, economically, or militarily while China took a leadership role in Asia. And so what that meant was you continued to see large amounts of US economic assistance going to India. You even saw military assistance even after the 62 war. You saw intelligence sharing with India allowing, for example, U-2 spy planes to take off from bases in India to conduct reconnaissance over China. You see an air defense agreement signed in 1963 that called for mutual consultations in the event between the US and India in the event of another Chinese attack on India. You even see bizarre kind of initiatives like a joint US-India expedition to the Himalayas to place a nuclear-powered monitoring device there to keep an eye on the Chinese nuclear program. But during this period in the 60s, you also see disagreement between the US and India on the subject of how to approach this China challenge. There is kind of disagreement on how to spend resources, how India should spend resources, whether India should be spending that much on defense or whether it should be focusing on development at home. There's disagreement on whether Pakistan could be part of India's China solution, as Washington believed, or if it was part of India's China problem, as Delhi saw it. There's disagreement between the US and India on whether India should have a more exclusive partnership with the US-led bloc, or whether India should maintain a diversified portfolio of partnerships, as Delhi preferred, a set of partnerships that included a very important one with Moscow. But there's also disillusionment in this period. In both Delhi and Washington, there's concern about whether the other country was capable of playing a helpful role in Asia and against China. And you see this mix of dependence and disillusionment. You hear it in a phone call, of which is available online, between President Johnson and his US ambassador to the UN. President Johnson is frustrated with India's lack of economic reform. And he just says, we are doing so much to help against China, to hold up fighting a war in Vietnam, to save all these Asian countries from communism. And why doesn't India do its part? And so the US ambassador to the UN turns around and says, okay, let India fail then. Let it go communist. And Johnson stops his rant against India then and says, no, I can't do that. I can't lose India, because that's what they said Truman and Acheson did with China. And for him, if he lost India, not only would that be a blow to the US strategic framework and objectives in Asia, it would be politically harmful for him, as he saw it had been for President Truman and Acheson. And he thought the Democratic Party could not recover from that loss. But towards the end of his administration, as it starts to become clearer that India could actually manage, it wouldn't fall or fail, that it could manage independently to keep China at bay. And this was in part thanks to the 1967 Natala clashes, where India comes out actually quite well. But also the economy starts to recover from the setbacks in 65 and 66 in particular. By then, the US becomes a little bit more, the Johnson administration says India can manage. And you see the two sides start to drift apart. They don't need each other that much anymore. And over the next decade, from about 1969 to 1979, which is the rest of the decade this book covers, what we see overall is a period of disengagement, but with one key period of divergence that comes first. Once again, a period of divergence driven by China. But this time, it's in a different way, thanks to the China-US rapprochement. Earlier, it had been a divergence because India had been urging China and the US to talk. Now, it's a divergence because India is the target of that rapprochement in some ways, inadvertently. In the lead up to and during the 1971 India-Pakistan war, this effort at China-US rapprochement on the part of the Nixon administration, particularly President Nixon and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, meant that India found it could not depend on the US coming to its assistance if China intervened on behalf of Pakistan. And one thing we forget now, that from about 1962-63, there was a sense in Delhi that they had an implicit assurance from the US that this would happen. And what they also found is that Nixon and Kissinger were backing Chinese partner Pakistan, which was serving for them as a channel to China. Indeed, this fact of needing to back Chinese partner Pakistan, indeed even led Nixon and Kissinger to encourage China to intervene on behalf of Pakistan during the war. And so this leads to that real low point, which has of course been written about considerably in the US-India relationship, that is remembered to this day, and that moment of the US's enterprise coming into the Bay of Bengal. But it's also led to India deepening its engagement with the Soviet Union and signing that 1971 treaty between the two countries. And this kind of led to, while it led to India deepening engagement with the Soviet Union, between the US and India, this final period that my book covers is really one of disengagement between about 1973 and 1979. And it's not just because of the 1971 war and the fallout from that. Significantly, it's because that with the rapprochement with China, having made up with China because of its larger goals vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, the US no longer needed India as a counter balance in Asia. India, on its part, now had a Soviet insurance policy against China and also moved towards an independent nuclear deterrent around this point. And so, and nonetheless, though, while kind of the two sides had started, they had new friends, so to speak, closer new friends, you see a period where India becomes wary of overdependence on Moscow. And so it seeks to do two things during the Ford and Carter administrations that followed the Nixon administration. For one, what you see first Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and then Prime Minister Morarji Desai doing is they try to stabilize relations with the US. And second, they seek India's own rapprochement with China. And this was indeed something the US not just supported, the Ford and Carter administrations not just supported during this time, but they tried to facilitate. And so you see kind of this relationship, this US, India, China triangle come full circle, so to speak. In 1949, you had India encouraging China and the US to engage. And now by 1979, you have the US encouraging China and India to do so. And my book ends with a meeting in April 1979 with President Carter and then Foreign Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee, where Carter's indeed, that is what he's encouraging. That India and that Prime Minister Desai and Foreign Minister Vajpayee should continue their effort at making up with China. There had been some disappointment after the Vajpayee visit to China earlier that year, that when the China-Vietnam War had broken out, that India felt betrayed in some ways. But Carter encouraged him to continue India's rapprochement with China. And so my book ends with that meeting in which kind of China is being discussed. And of course, 2 decades after that meeting in 1979, Vajpayee was prime minister, and we saw the beginnings of what we consider today's phase of convergence. And with that, kind of, I will end the historical part, and maybe we can get into some of the contemporary resonance of the book in Q&A.
Thank you so much, Tanvi, in fact, for carving out the broad contours of the relationship between the three nations and how, in fact, one factor, that is the China factor, has been affecting the entire dynamics of the US and the Indian relations. So it's very interesting to know that how they converged and where they diverged. Of course, my questions have already been posed to you at the very outset. But prior to that, I would like to go to Mr. Anant Krishnan. Very interestingly, Tanvi, in fact, questions are already, the chat box is already getting flooded with questions. And there are also quite a few questions, in fact, in the Q&A box. So we will take them up selectively. But prior to that, let me go to Anant and hear his views. Anant, it's up to you.
Thank you so much. I thought I would try and bring this discussion a little bit to the present day. And speaking from the point of view of a reporter who covers the India-China relationship as it is today. Just to say at the outset, I found this to be such a valuable piece of research for, I think, anyone who's interested in this triangular relationship today, whether you're in university or journalists. I think sometimes we kind of fall into the trap of thinking that everything we're writing about today is new and happening for the first time. But I think on the contrary, this reminds us that this is far from the case. So I just wanted to flag three themes that I think we regularly encounter in our writing and analysis of this three-way relationship today, and perhaps try and ask what lessons we might draw from Dr. Madan's research and from this book. I think the first is this idea that she mentioned, this idea of India as a counterweight to China. It's something we hear every time India-US, India-China relations are discussed. And you're guaranteed to hear this on television every time an Indian Prime Minister goes to America or a US president visits. This book, one thing I liked about this book is it's full of remarkable quotes. And I think that's testament to the kind of research that's gone into it. But one particular quote that stayed with me was, quote, "India was potentially a great counterweight to China." And what struck me was this was said not in 2019, not even in 1999, but this was from Time magazine in October 1949, when the PRC was just barely a few days old. And I think this theme has been repeated so often. And I, for one, had the misplaced notion before reading this book that this was something of a much more recent vintage. And here you have it, even just as the PRC was being established, this was how some in Washington were looking at India playing this role. So I think a question that should be asked, which we could get into in the Q&A as well, is 7 decades on, is it still a relevant prism with which to look at US-India relations? Dr. Madan stresses throughout the book that, correctly, China is by no means the only prism to look at the India-US relationship, which is a vast relationship and has its own logic. But there's no denying, as she reminds us, that it's certainly one important one. But we should ask, does this notion of a counterweight make sense when you have Washington and Delhi, as we see throughout the book, often having very different expectations and ideas about what actually this means? Now, the second related point is on the notion of how far the India-US partnership should go and how comfortable people in India are about that question. So there's always been a constituency in India arguing that India is perhaps too cautious when it comes to dealing with America. They see the legacy of non-alignment as being a part of India's past. We would be better off forgetting or leaving in the dustbin. And I think one would probably expect this chorus to grow louder going forward because of what we're seeing from China, which is the rising aggressiveness, the rising assertiveness from China. And make no mistake, regardless of COVID-19, I think this is only going to continue. I mean, even yesterday, we've seen in the middle of this pandemic, there are news reports of concerning developments in the South China Sea. And I think Dr. Madan's account does, however, sound an important cautionary note when it comes to the idea of putting all our eggs in one basket. You only need look at this extraordinary lurch the book describes in great detail from October 62, when we were requesting American air support, to 1971 and the Sino-US rapprochement. And I think, again, one reason she repeatedly comes back to is this problem of mismatched expectations. And I think she uses this great phrase, which she mentioned in her remarks as well, that the prospect of an alliance per se is neither inevitable nor impossible. And I really like that formulation. So it's always existed in this kind of twilight, and one might expect it to remain so as well. But just as there's a constituency that is for closer relations, there also is one that just about opposes every little thing we do with America, which is ironically also a legacy from that period. And I think this book offers a counter to them as well. This isn't to say that India should not go ahead with much closer economic, technological, defense relations with the US, which we are seeing is already happening. And the fact is there's perhaps no other country, I think, that comes close to offering India the kind of support we need in all of these areas when we continue with our own domestic transformations at home. And I think we do well to remember, as she puts it, India's relationship with America is not one of linear progression as conventional wisdom imagines it to be. It's often been subject to vicissitudes that extend beyond the bilateral relationship. So that's something for us to keep in mind as well. The last point that I wanted to bring up was non-alignment. And I think that Dr. Madan does a great job in helping us make sense of this abused term. If you're on social media, you'll see how you can't have a debate about China or foreign policy or Nehru without this coming up and often misrepresented in many ways. it's now very fashionable to disparage non-alignment and to be fair, to disparage Pandit Nehru as well. But I think a lot of every criticism we see doesn't often situate the context in which these policies were made. And I think this book really helps us do that, right from the China war in 62 to other developments that followed. And I think one point on 62 that Dr. Madan makes, which I think is really underappreciated, that it was not so much that Nehru was a dove on China or blind to the dangers of the communist regime. We see that being expressed in this book repeatedly. Some may argue he was the opposite. But one major reason she reminds us was this belief that other powers would get involved and come to India's aid, especially Moscow, which turned out to be a big miscalculation. And I think as Dr. Madan concludes in her book, one problem with how we look at non-alignment today is perhaps it means different things to different people. And when they are involved in the same debate, you aren't going to get very far. So it was not about isolation. It was quite the opposite. As she says, it was about autonomy. It was about diversification. And India realized early on that in a strange way, building independence required, as she puts it, some level of dependence. But now the argument is that because you aren't in a Cold War situation, there aren't, even though it's a China-US rivalry, you aren't looking at two blocks. So this thinking is irrelevant. But I think as she tells us, this strategy of diversification that underpins it, which came to be known as non-alignment, was aimed at expanding India's range of options. And that's something that's still relevant today. And one strawman criticism we see, whether it's of non-alignment or whether it's strategic autonomy, as we call it today, is the false assumption that this means being equidistant. But I think as she tells us, that was never the case right from the start. And at different times, India saw it as it's in its own interest to pursue closer relationships as it saw fit. So I'll just conclude by saying this book reminds us that many of these same issues we're talking about today were playing out decades ago, even if they've kind of fallen out of the public memory. And I think this book does a great service by reminding us of some of these lessons from history.
Thank you, Anant. Very nice and cogent presentation and a very nice discussion on what the book essentially entails, especially from your perspective. Of course, as you rightly pointed out, it's not a very linear relation, and it had its own curves and points of inflection as far as US, India, and China are concerned. And more importantly, as you mentioned, that the issue of non-alignment as far as this volume is concerned has been dealt with in a very, very nice and cogent way. I mean, after listening to both these discussions, it appears to me that is this triad, this entire trinity, is this really an irreconcilable trinity? And that's what is going to remain in the future. Mostly because the way, in fact, the pandemic has unfolded and the global economic order and the global political and the strategic order has been unfolding over time, the way the globe has been looking at China, it seems to be no more a preferred strategic partner for any of these major powers. So, well, with that kind of a concern, I would like to move to the questions, which are already plenty, in fact, out here. So we can select a few and would request Tanvi to respond. And also I would go back to Anant for his comments as well. So the first question, Tanvi, in fact, is from Rajkumar Kothari, who states that why do you suggest that even in the initial years of Cold War, Indo-US relations were shaped by China factor, taking into account the fact that China itself till late 1950s were dependent upon the then Soviet Union ideologically and even militarily. Should you take 2-3 questions together at a time? Will that be convenient?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so yeah, that is one. And second is from Ramakant Tiwari, who states that is the period between 1979 to 1989 completely left out in the book. Probably we finally saw the end of the Cold War in 1989. Amitabh Bonik, his question is that, do you think that India's to and fro approach in regards to its relation with US or major powers like China or Russia has somehow hindered formation of a strong and consistent foreign policy for India? So would you like to take 3 of this together and maybe in fact we can take up the other questions later on.
Sure. And if you could just, or I can actually take a look at it, that last question.
Should I repeat that? Okay.
Actually, I see it here. So it's,
okay.
Is this about the boundary, whether the boundary will be used?
Do you think that India's to and fro approach, it's from Amitabh Bonik, do you think that India's to and fro approach in regard to its relation with US or major powers like China or Russia has somehow hindered formation of a strong and consistent foreign policy for India?
Thank you for those questions. I mean, the quickest one to answer is the question of the 80s. I mean, one of the reasons I didn't cover the 80s, and I do in an epilogue in the book, is partly because this book is largely based on archival documents, and when it was completed, there wasn't much available on the 80s. There is now, and I will be covering the 80s in this current book that I'm working on, which is called A Balancing Act, which is looking at India's choices vis-a-vis China and the US from 1980 to the present day, and then looking into the future. So I will be covering it. Just briefly, what you do see in the 80s is what you start to see towards the end of the book, which is the US encouraging India and China to actually engage with each other. Because the US actually had good relations with both China, even though it starts to improve relations somewhat with the Soviet Union, there had still been kind of a falling out in that sense. But you also see India being quite concerned about what the US relationship with China meant for India's own interest, specifically to do with kind of US, China, and Pakistan partnering with each other. And you see this in two contexts. One is Afghanistan, where you see China actually helping the US out in kind of supporting Pakistan. And Steve Cole's book, Ghost Wars, actually talks about this in great detail. And so India is concerned about what that partnership and support ends up meaning, which in India's mind means that that the US essentially looks the other way as China supports Pakistan, particularly this nuclear program. So it still has implication in the 80s, and I'm hoping to look into that a little more in detail as I work on my next book. Why do I say that China shaped US-India relations in that first decade? So actually before, in fact, let me take you even 2 years before 1949, when China is formed. In 1947, when India becomes independent, and it's good for comparison, that both the CIA and the State Department do separate studies categorizing countries in their level of importance and where they stand from around the world in terms of US strategy. And in both studies independently, India features in kind of the lowest category. And in the first 2 years, in 47, 48, it just wasn't that important. The US focus was on Europe. And so it really wasn't kind of as important for the US. But certain things change in 49. The Cold War intensifies, partly because of the Soviet nuclear test, but you can't underestimate how much what the US saw as the fall of China really kind of encapsulates all these concerns that the US had, because after all, it wasn't just China being lost, it was who was losing it, which was US ally or partner, one shouldn't throw the term ally around, so you see Chiang Kai-shek. And so there was this sense, and by the way, that sense was shared in India, that the reason, in fact, the Nehru government was deeply concerned about the fall of China, but from a different perspective. They thought Chiang Kai-shek had not delivered the goods to his people, and so the communists had sought an opportunity. And you have these discussions between Nehru and Patel that, for example, if their government didn't deliver, the communists, which both Nehru and Patel at home were extremely anti-communist, they would take advantage. So you actually saw kind of in both countries a very close eye on China. And in the US, once this fall of China happens, and then particularly after the Korean War, Asia becomes much more of a priority. And in this context, what's happening vis-a-vis, you suddenly see between kind of 47, 48 and the shift in 49 to elevating India in importance from a category, it does not matter, to Nehru receiving this presidential welcome. That, tells you for the next decade why India matters. In those first few years, India is seen as a problem for the US vis-a-vis China. So I hope you read the book, because it's hard for me to tell you the entire decade. As Anand pointed out, I'm not saying, the Pakistan factor doesn't matter, the Soviet Union factor doesn't matter. What I'm saying is you cannot understand, for example, the level of kind of estrangement. It's not just because of, for India, the Cold War comes to India's door, not with the 1950s kind of treaty between the US and Pakistan. It comes earlier. It comes in the 40s, and it comes because of what's happening in the East. My argument is that, you have to look at this to get a more comprehensive sense of the US-India relationship. The toing and froing between various countries. I mean, one of the reasons I actually tried to look at the strategy in, underpinning non-alignment. Why is it that leader after leader in India comes? They might tilt one way or the other, but at the end of the day, this most consistent element of Indian foreign policy is this maintaining a diversified portfolio of partners. It doesn't matter who comes in. In the beginning, when Prime Minister Modi first came in, there was a sense that he was going, he's tilting towards the US, or leaning too much to the US. Even he, in the last few years, has, but even in his early years, maintained relations with a large number of countries, including China. I argue it's because, for a couple of reasons. One, that it's not non-alignment or strategic autonomy per se. It is why this exists in the first place, which is leaders since the beginning, from Nehru on, have understood that while, independence, self-sufficiency might be, the goal, that in reality, it's actually not actually possible. And so you're going to be dependent or interdependent on other countries. And so what you want to try to do is, how do you then maintain your space? Is you try to reduce dependence, and the way to do that, every leader has argued, is to build Indian capability. Now, they've done it to different degrees, but you reduce dependence by building your own capability. But at the same time, you diversify your dependence and thereby reduce the power that any single country has on you. And part of building those partnerships in themselves are useful to build your capability if you use them well. And so I actually think the toing and froing is just about the different countries, but this has actually been a very consistent element. You can argue that, look, it has meant big losses, whether it left India kind of exposed in 62 or in the 70s and 80s, it made India over-dependent on Russia. Well, these are things in hindsight, but leaders themselves, and this is actually, I think some of it is they have, if you look through the cost-benefit analysis, they've come to the conclusion it's the best policy for India, particularly if not just, when Indian leaders say, what are your objectives? It's not just security and economic prosperity. I would argue that most Indian leaders have put strategic autonomy or some version of it as a goal in itself. And if that's your goal, this is the best strategy for you. And I suspect we'll be arguing that, and people who live beyond us will be arguing about that in the next 100 years, because this is probably continue unless something dramatic happens between India and China for a while.
There's a very interesting question from Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia. Would you agree that India prefers partnership and hates the idea of alliance when it comes to US? So would you like to respond to that, Tanvi?
Sure. I think there's a couple of things. So I think one of the things I point out in the book is, I think it's not just an alliance with the US. I think India has, as I said, there's India doesn't ally, but it does align. And it's done it at least twice, once with the US for about a decade after, in the 60s. And then obviously with the Soviet Union. And so, people have used different terms. Some used the term at the time. Nehru used the term tilt. Others used the word lean. I think in common parlance today, we'd say align, which is that there are periods of time where India has been closer to one country or one set of countries. So alliance might be strategic taboo for India. I don't think alignment has. And I actually think, today when we think about caution with regard to the US, I do agree that I think India does not want to ally with the US, or for that matter, for example, and Indira Gandhi is a great example of this. She's seen now as very pro-Soviet. But in 1969, when the Soviets came to her with a treaty to sign, she's the one who, despite a lot of her advisors saying we should sign this treaty, which eventually they signed in 71, that we should sign it, she's the one who said no. And she said, no, because that will be seen as and will mean an alliance, and I do not want to sign that. And she did it when there was a sense that there was no other choice, and they got some other language rewritten so it would be less alliance-like in nature. But I think this is not just the US, this is kind of not wanting alliances because they are thought to kind of constrain India, going back to that idea that, you know, Indian kind of leaders during the freedom struggle were not given a choice for Britain to take India into the Second World War. So you want to kind of maintain that choice. But I will say this concept of alignment is different, and it is something India does. And when we're thinking about caution with regard to the US, some of the things that people think are anathema today, even the father of non-alignment, if you want to consider him such, Nehru actually did. It was Nehru who signed off on the air defense agreement. It was Nehru who, you know, allowed U-2s to take off from Indian bases. I can just imagine the reaction today if there was a proposal by somebody to allow the US to do that. And so there was intelligence sharing that was signed off by Nehru. There was a collaboration between the US and India on Tibet during that time. So, and then same with the Soviet Union later. There has been less caution in the past. It's just that I think today there's more hesitation. Finally, I'll just say on this point, one of the things that intrigued me, I don't think just this idea of non-alignment and it's just strategic. It's something Shashi Tharoor mentioned in his dissertation many years ago. His dissertation was called Reasons of State. It's very hard to get book now, but he talked about how Nehru had come up and the leaders around him had come up with this idea of non-alignment, but it eventually starts to constrain them itself because it now becomes part of the idea of India. And so even when leaders have wanted to and needed to align, now they have to kind of, it's domestically that there's pushback sometimes more than from within their own government. And so I think now every leader has to deal with that. So sometimes even when leaders want to, whether it's the establishment or others, they have to grapple with the fact that it's become strategic autonomy, whatever you want to call it, even though you won't use the term, it's become part of the kind of idea of India now.
There's another question by Trisha. This is Trisha asks, I'm curious whether Dr. Madan came across any Chinese perspectives on India from 1962. This is in fact something that you would be interested in responding to. Did Chairman Mao view India with the same comradeship afforded by Nehru?
So this is a very good question. And one of the things, unfortunately, I could not do in the book is also look at and cover the Chinese perspective. It would have been double the size, and I don't have the Chinese language skills to have done it justice. So I'm hoping others will. But they are actually available, including some really interesting documents that are worthwhile to look at. And the Cold War International History Project has, it's available online, CWIHP, if you Google that. Which has translated a lot of Chinese documents. But there is a lot of kind of, what I did come across is a fair bit of kind of discussion on, for China, particularly pre-62, and I would say in the early 50s in particular, there's actually a fair bit of disdain in the beginning, somewhat stemming from the fact that even the Soviet Union in the early years, till about 1952, 1953, the Soviet Union actually had a lot of disdain for India, thought it was bourgeois, run by a bourgeois government that was essentially going to follow the US and Britain in particular. But you see then, and the Korean War is kind of very indicative for the Chinese, where they see India's role as genuinely neutral in a way that they had not expected, and in from their mind actually useful for them. So they see India as, and then, you know, going up to Bandung, India is actually speaking, giving them a voice, and so it's useful. And you know, I'm not sure how much I buy into the Asia for Asians language, but I think they thought that there was an incentive. They were motivated to actually have a cooperative relationship. That changes because I think both because of the boundary, but also because of the question of Tibet, which for the Chinese is a very, very sensitive subject. And as Anant will tell you, because he's kind of studied kind of the Chinese perspective and lived there as well, this idea of, now you could disagree with it, but in the Chinese leadership's mind, they saw India as interfering in Tibet, weakening them. And remember, this was a very insecure government at the time. regime at the time in China, and doing so in collusion and collaboration with the US. So they thought, and this intensifies over the course of the 50s. And, yes, there's very active collaboration between US and India and Tibet. What we do know is at the very least in the 50s, in the mid to late 50s, whether or not we still don't have definitive evidence other than, B. N. Malik and others talking about, collaborating on the intelligence side. We don't have definitive evidence, but what we do know is that New Delhi was very aware of what the US was doing in Tibet. There were overflights from the US over India into Tibet. They knew about it. They occasionally said, try to do this in less visible ways. But we don't have evidence of that, India actually collaborated. Nonetheless, Chinese saw it that way, and things did deteriorate. So it changes over the course of the 50s.
Well, there's a question by an anonymous.
If I just add to that point,
yes, please go ahead.
I think, as Tanvi said, it's quite interesting if you actually look at some of the words from the Cold War History Project that Mao uses to describe Nehru. There is no love lost. He calls him an imperialist, and he thinks he's inherited all these attributes of the British. And one thing that I saw in the Chinese archives, which are now shut, unfortunately, when I looked at some of the things between 1959 and 62, was, as Tanvi says, so much of it was about Nehru and Tibet. It was not, the war was not so much about, was never about the land. And I would recommend people to even take a look at John Garver's work on this, where he not only quotes extensively from Mao's own words, how he looked at Nehru, but also brings about how so much this Tibet insecurity played a role in the Chinese imagination and how they looked at Nehru and how they looked at India at that time.
Thank you, Anand. There is a question, in fact, from an anonymous attendee, but I would like that to be highlighted here. The question is to Tanvi, that as far as US strategy to South Asia is concerned, most writers feel that US did not always look back, always back its allies during the Cold War in South Asia. So, for example, 1965 to the 1971 Indo-Pak War. So, if India would have been in the US bloc, what result might have been with reference to Bangladesh? So, Tanvi, you can respond to that. And there is another, but I presume that you can take another one. This is from Hari Vasudevan, that how far have continuities in presence of personalities such as Vajpayee acted as a link between pre-1979 and the 2000s? Does the passing of that generation limit the importance of perspectives that that Madan deals with? So one is related to that the US didn't back its allies, and the second one is related to the personalities. So first Tanvi, and then I can also come to Anand.
Just on the align, kind of the US not backing, I think, this is something that even there's actually quite a fair bit of discussion during the time. And one thing, a lot of these questions are very debated during the early years of Indian independence, and even after, within government, outside government. So, when people talk about a consensus view on Indian foreign policy or kind of a Nehru, it was constantly contested and debated. This question of whether India should, go in for an alliance commitment. And one of the reasons the Indian side would often say, even before the 60s, is now the US would say, look, alliance is different. These days we throw around the word ally a lot, but an alliance means a security commitment of some sort. Which, is something different from the colloquial use of the term ally. And with that commitment means there's something on paper, and you will at the very least be, sure of or not sure, but at least that's the argument that's made, that there's a commitment or an assurance. Now, what kind of a number of people in India, on the Indian side even then said, look, that doesn't, but how reliable are allies going to be? At the end of the day, they're going to, now, so there's this debate about, well, alliances do give you more reliability, but yes, it comes with certain constraints, whereas the Indian side would say, well, are you really going to be there? And so this debate actually comes up. I think that it is different. It would have been different for the US had India been a treaty ally, because then it becomes about US credibility. If there is kind of the sense of if there's a loss of India, at the very least, you wouldn't have had discussions about encouraging China to kind of, jump in against India in the 1971 war. But you would have seen kind of, people in India at the time would have said, look, but you would have also seen the US having more leverage to put pressure on India to act in a certain way. Just there's a difference between 65 and 71. In 71, the US and India, the US, China, and Pakistan were in some ways ranged together versus India, Soviet Union. 65 is very different. 65, this is when not just India, Pakistan are fighting this war, but the Chinese threatened to intervene. In fact, what is not realized now is that in India, there was more concern in 65 that the Chinese were going to intervene than 1971, and more concern about it, because it was only 3 years after the 62 war. And so the Indian policymakers actually go to the US and say, we want you to kind of say that you will intervene if China intervenes. Now, the US side, unbeknownst to India, so they do two things. One, they actually say to India, are you invoking the air defense agreement? At which point India's like, wait, we don't know if we want to do that. Privately, what the US is doing is 2 or 3-fold. For one, the operational plans that I mentioned. There's a conversation between LBJ and Bob McNamara, then Defense Secretary, but it was very clear that if China intervened, the US was probably going to intervene on India's behalf. But they also do one other thing. There's a Warsaw Channel between the US and China at the time, where the ambassadors would talk. And the US essentially warns China against intervening. They deter China, saying, if you intervene in this India-Pakistan war, we will have to rethink the level of our involvement to deter China. They do not, however, tell India that they have done this, because they thought if they gave India that insurance, India would continue to fight against Pakistan. And what they wanted was a ceasefire. So, in the Indian policymakers' mind, the US was not helping deter China because they didn't necessarily know and weren't jumping in. But, secretly, that's what the US was doing. So they are kind of two different things. Just kind of quickly on the question of personalities. So one of the things I say in the book is that, look, personalities which often kind of dominate the narratives of US-India relations, there is no doubt they are important. But I actually think their role has been overemphasized in US-India narratives. How do you explain, as Anant did better than me, explain the kind of, that you having the same views from 49 to the current day? It is because there's certain what we call structural explanations, this geopolitical balance of power theme that keeps coming up, or this idea of India not just a counterweight in the balance of power sense, but a democratic contrast. It's because certain ideas stick and certain moments come up. And so even as you have that generation, and that generation had a lot of debates on these questions. So Vajpayee was very different from, even a Morarji Desai on these questions. But you have, they changed their mind. Vajpayee's kind of skepticism of the US goes up and down during the course of his career. But it's very much about kind of structural reasons. And at the end of the day, you often see it's about whether it's American or Indian policymakers, what is in our interests and where the other country fits in. What is our interest, what's the framework, and where the other country fits in. So to just give you one example, and then I'm sure Anant can add to this, he's come across these personalities much more up close, is somebody like a Richard Nixon or a John Foster Dulles, who in the early 50s, John Foster Dulles, then Secretary of State in the Eisenhower administration, was seen as very kind of anti-India, as was Nixon. Nixon and Dulles Nixon was then vice president, called India's what they call neutrality or non-alignment immoral. Within a few years, by the kind of late 60s, 1957, both these leaders are going to US Congress and making the case to increase financial assistance, economic assistance to India on the grounds that you had to help India succeed in this fateful economic race against China. Same people, but it's the structural factors and their visions of it that have changed.
Well, in fact, we are almost at the end of it. So now, in fact, I just request both the panelists to intervene for 2 minutes, especially with respect to my question that was related to how the future is going to unfold as far as the dynamics of the triad is concerned. What do you think as far, what is your perception on as far as the Indo-Pacific or the South China Sea, or suppose say the engagements, wherever this triad is going to, engage with each other, how will that unfold? So first I will go for Anant and then Tanvi. Anant, 2 minutes.
I think, Ranjan, one interesting thing that we're looking at is one face of this triangle, which is the US-China relationship is, for lack of a better word, is falling off a cliff. And what this means for the triangle is something I think for us to look at very closely. I think it was already happening with the trade war before COVID-19. And I think the pandemic, in all likelihood, will probably hasten this. We had a very prominent Chinese scholar, Wang Zhi, say recently that he thinks the decoupling is irreversible. What does that mean for India? How do we navigate this? I think it's a big issue that we're all going to be writing about, looking at the next few months, years. And I'll just wrap up by saying that I think many of the themes we're going to deal with when looking at this new changed context will be harking back to many of the themes that Tanvi writes about in this book. So my final words would be read it and you'd be better off in making sense of what's going to happen going forward.
So Tanvi, so is history going to bear a lesson for us in the way the triangle is simply going to unfold in the future?
Thanks, Rajan. Thank you, Anant, as well. And by the way, Pushan Das, who is managing this, if ORF can send me the questions in chat that we haven't answered, I'm happy to answer them on Twitter. And maybe I'll do that later today and just answer some of the questions that were posed. But just to this question, I actually think history does offer, because I think, some of these questions about that India is going to, for example, try to navigate, as Anant put it, this kind of bipolar competition. But I want to talk about just two differences. And it doesn't, I think, the lessons of history still offer kind of reasons why. It also provides you the context for why India lacks so much trust in China, for example, and why it's going to be hard for India to play the middle path thing that it did in the Cold War. The two differences that India is going to have to grapple with as it looks forward to this bipolar competition compared to the last superpower competition. In the old Cold War, India could easily say, look, we don't have any direct conflicts with either the US or the Soviet Union. Let's play one off against the other. India could essentially do what now a lot of the smaller South Asian states, the Sri Lankas, the Bangladesh, here are two powers, they have competition. How do we make use of it, create leverage for ourselves? This is different for India. This involves one antagonist in that superpower competition with which India has direct conflicts that have nothing to do with the US. It is about India, China. It is also India's neighbor at the same time. And neither the US or Soviet Union was. So that has to be factored in terms of, has India seized this superpower confrontation? The second is something Anant just actually has a new report about for Brookings India on the India-China economic links and China's interest. His report looks at kind of Chinese investment in India. But this is what makes this period different. It doesn't mean some of the trends won't be the same. And I actually think COVID is just going to reinforce a lot of the trends we were already seeing on the US side or in the Indian side when it comes to China in some ways. But I think, this is partly what makes the US and Soviet Union were not interdependent. India and China were not economically intertwined during the Cold War, during these old periods. Now we're seeing this in the COVID context. On the one hand, you're seeing greater FDI scrutiny being proposed, deep concern about Indian dependence on China, deep concern about some of these kind of Chinese influence issues, geopolitical behavior. But you're also seeing in India at the same time, the government not take that hostile rhetorical stance that, say, the Trump administration has, with the Indian government realizing that as much as it has these concerns about China, this is also a country that India has to do business with. That's where the APIs come from. That's where personal protective what happens if this is the country that comes up with a vaccine and for a while might have a monopoly? So this kind of idea that this is a different world than it was before, but you're going to see some of the same themes. And what I think will drive Indian behavior will continue to be this idea that we've seen for a while, which is not wanting any single power to dominate Asia. And second, to be able to find a path that is independent and build autonomy, not autarky, because that's not possible, not in total independence, but to some extent, how does India expand its options as it sees these two superpowers face off?
Right. So thank you. Thanks to both the panelists. In fact, we shouldn't be concluding at this point in time because, I mean, the questions are still burning and there are a host of issues, a host of variables, in fact, which need to be taken into account when you talk about the dynamics of this nature. Because this is not really, as Anant mentioned, the relationship is definitely not linear. And I presume the relationship simply cannot be modeled in the quadrants. Rather, we have to think of something beyond the two axes. And I presume that it's not only one exogenous variable of China, but there are a host of variables that keep on shaping the relation. And as Tanvi rightly mentions, that history bears a whole lot of lessons for us on how essentially the dynamics of the triad or dynamics of, suppose, say, any form of economies, nations, and entities essentially are going to be formed over time. So there are shocks. There are, in fact, exogenous factors. They keep on impeding into a system and eventually frame and keep on shaping the kind of relations that we find unfolding, in fact, in the global geostrategic space. So with that, I'd like to thank all of you. We are well past over time. So thanks a lot for a very engaging and a very fruitful discussion from which I learned a lot. And of course, this really makes a clear statement on why this book should be read and in fact, why this book in fact deserves more and more discussions in the public space. Thank you. Thanks to Tanvi, thanks to Anand, thanks to all the participants and for raising very, very interesting questions. Let me apologize yet again that there were many other interesting questions which I simply couldn't accommodate because of lack of time. Thanks all.